you, and thank you, Redwan, for organizing, and thank you, everyone, for coming. It's very difficult to go after Monica and Eric, who are really two real experts on Tunisia, who know it well and who have been following it very closely. But let me try to speak to some of the assumptions that I think are driving US foreign policy towards Tunisia and try to question or challenge some of those underlying assumptions. So if we look back in the last year and a half, the US never applied as much pressure as it could have on Kais Saied, but in recent months, the US seems to be giving up almost entirely on putting pressure. The most recent statements that the US put out, as Monica noted, praised these parliamentary elections as an essential step towards democracy, despite these elections having some of the lowest turnout that the world has ever seen. They're clearly not a step towards democracy, or for that matter, towards stability, if there's only 10% trust in these institutions that he's creating. But if we look back 6 months before these statements, the US did seem to be on the right track. In the weeks right after the referendum last July, in late July, early August, the US did put out a number of very critical statements in rapid succession. You had Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, you had Joey Hood during his confirmation hearing, and then maybe most importantly, you had the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. All three of them made very critical statements of Kais Saied and the path he's taking Tunisia in rapid succession. And the last one by Lloyd Austin really did scare some folks in Tunisia. I heard from a number of contacts that one really got their attention because it signaled that maybe US military aid was actually on the line, and that more generally it signaled that this seemed to be at least a coordinated whole of government approach from the US to ramp up criticism of Tunisia. And so those statements in those weeks, late July, early August, seemed to make an effect. Now, you could say that statements don't do very much. It's just a statement from the US. And you're right that statements from the US are not going to change the attitudes of Tunisians who strongly support Kais Saied. A statement from the US is not going to change their support. Likewise, it's not going to change the attitudes of the Tunisians who are openly, strongly opposing Kais Saied. They're going to do that regardless of a US statement. But where US statements could have an effect is among the Tunisians who are in the middle, who are either neutral towards July 25th, or who are not willing to share their opinion. Perhaps they oppose it, but are not willing to say it. It's among this segment of society that US statements could have an effect, emboldening them to be open about their opposition, or even swaying their attitudes if they're truly on the fence. But the response of Kais Saied to those strong statements from the US in late July, early August, seemed to scare the US into backing off. That response of Kais Saied was to publicly call out the US's statements, paint them as being foreign interference in Tunisian affairs. The UGTT likewise called it foreign interference. A number of other small parties did as well. And perhaps just as Kais Saied wanted, the US backed off, went silent for the next 3 months, and then went on to praise these latest elections. And the US, in my mind, made two assumptions when it decided to go silent at that point. The first was that if Kais Saied is going to paint our statements as foreign interference, then they'll no longer be effective in swaying Tunisian public opinion, especially among those who are neutral or in the middle. That the statements won't be effective if they're painted as foreign interference. And secondly, even worse for the US, it might create a backlash against the US, fuel anti-American sentiment that we are meddling in Tunisian affairs. Those two assumptions are testable. You can look at public opinion and see what happens when US statements are painted as foreign interference. And so I tried to do that, to try to test these assumptions in a survey I conducted of Tunisians in September of last year. And I want to share two quick slides that show some results from that survey. So the survey I conducted was in September of last year. It was a nationally representative face-to-face survey of 1,200 Tunisians that one-to-one for research and polling, one of the most reputable firms in Tunisia, the one that does the Eurobarometer and the Afrobarometer, conducted. And what I added into the survey was a survey experiment where half of the sample was primed to remember this exchange where several American officials expressed their concerns with the democratic path in Tunisia, and President Kais Saied then rejected these as foreign interference. And we can then compare those half of the sample that are reminded to think about this to a control group who is not reminded about what happened, to see what effect it had. And so the first assumption is that if these statements are painted as foreign interference, then they're not going to have any effect. And so the question I asked was, in your opinion, is Tunisia experiencing democratic backsliding? And we would think that these US statements might have an effect among those who are somewhat neutral or don't know their attitudes towards July 25th. And so here in this figure, I've divided the sample into those who earlier in the survey said they strongly support July 25th, those who said they oppose July 25th, and then those who said they don't know what they think about July 25th. And what you see is that reminding Tunisians of these US statements, even when they're painted as foreign interference, didn't have any effect among those who support the coup, likewise among those who openly oppose the coup. But they did have an effect among those who were neutral or said don't know what they think about July 25th. There, if you reminded them about the US's statements, even when they're painted as foreign interference, you saw a significant increase in the percent of people who are saying there has been democratic backsliding in the last year. It almost doubled the percent of people who said there is some democratic backsliding. So the takeaway there is that US statements, even when they're painted as foreign interference, seem to still work. There does seem to be an increase among people willing to say that there has been backsliding among this segment who are neutral or say don't know initially. Then the second assumption is whether there might be a backlash, that the US is seen as meddling in Tunisian affairs. So here I asked a second question. Moving forward, do you think Tunisia should reduce or improve its relations with the United States? And if there is a backlash, we should see fewer Tunisians saying we want to improve relations with the United States. But what we see among all three of these groups is no effect. There doesn't seem to be any backlash. There is a slight reduction for each of these groups in the percent who are saying they want to improve relations with the US, but none of this is statistically significant. There is no difference in the attitudes among those who are reminded that the US made these statements that were painted as foreign interference. In short, there doesn't seem to be any backlash in public opinion against the US when it makes these statements. So in short, both of these assumptions that seem to lead the US to go silent don't seem to hold in this survey, that in fact, US statements might still have an effect and don't generate any sort of backlash. Now, the third major assumption that I think has driven the US to go relatively silent is the one that Monica touched on about China and Russia, that maybe if the US is too critical, if it suspends aid, that it might leave a void for China and Russia to fill. But I think we can respond in two ways. One is that if China and Russia were truly going to jump in and provide aid to Kais Saied, they would have already done it, and they are going to do it either way. Us giving U.S. assistance to Tunisia is not going to stop Kais Saied from exploring other options. Even Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, that the US gives a lot of aid to and praise to, even they still explore outside options from China and Russia and praise, for instance, the war in Ukraine, or don't actively condemn it. And so if you think about Tunisia as well, Kais Saied in particular has said on multiple occasions that he doesn't want to ally with any one side. Even in the preamble of the constitution, he said that Tunisia is not going to align with any one side. And so the US giving aid to Kais Saied is not going to stop him from exploring other options. Providing money doesn't create a strong, committed ally. It just creates an ally who's willing to sell out to the highest bidder. Instead, the only way you would get a country to reliably ally with the US against China and Russia is through a shared commitment to democracy and human rights, values that distinguish the US from China and Russia. In short, if you want Tunisia to reliably ally with the US should do its best to help restore democracy. It's through that shared commitment that they would reliably ally with the US. So let me close with a couple of remarks on what I think the US could do beyond strong statements that I think I've shown would have an effect. The second is to think about US assistance to Tunisia. Monica did a good job laying out all the different potential pools of funding there. And I think it's important that they are all framed as carrots rather than sticks, that Tunisia would get this assistance on any of these funds if it agrees to a national dialogue and restoring democracy. Framing them as carrots can help in terms of this aid suspension. My guess is that the US is not willing to fully suspend aid, and instead, therefore, repurposing some of the aid can be helpful. The economic assistance can be repurposed, for instance, directly to the people as humanitarian assistance rather than going to the regime. With regards to military aid, the proportion that we may perhaps continue to give to Tunisia, that in my mind should be repurposed towards two elements. One is to hold some dialogues and discussions within the Tunisian military about what professionalism means. When we think about what happened on July 25th, the military was given an order from the commander-in-chief that maybe they had some doubts about whether this is constitutional or not, but they didn't have any channel to refer it to. There's no legal channel for them to refer it to courts to then see, was this order we're given legal or not? And so instead, the military thought, as professionals, we should obey what the commander-in-chief told us and follow through. And I think having some discussions about what professionalism really entails, about not following orders that are questionable, that have some constitutional questions, can be helpful. And I think in those discussions, it would be useful for the US military to be talking about what they were thinking on January 6th, about whether professionally they would be allowed to defend the Congress even against the wishes of the president. Those sort of discussions about what professionalism entails in these crisis moments, I think can be very useful moving forward for getting the Tunisian military to respond differently in moments like that. The second and related aspect is to set up some sort of office of general counsel within the Ministry of Defense, that the top officers can refer an order that they don't know if it's legal or constitutional. They can refer it to lawyers within the Ministry of Defense for them to weigh in on, rather than military officers having to decide the constitutionality themselves, something they're not qualified to do so. Setting up an office like that, like the US has, for instance, can be useful moving forward. forward. There might also be a role for the Department of Justice in the US to help set up an office like that. Finally, let me just make one small point before I close, which is that all of these steps, strong statements, the suspending of aid, these sorts of dialogues with the military, maybe they won't actually change Kais Saied's behavior and help restore democracy in Tunisia. But they are still important to pursue in terms of sending a signal to the region moving forward, to the world moving forward, about what happens if a populist leader takes a move like this, that there is real consequences that in turn might prevent some headaches for the US moving forward, even if it doesn't resolve this headache today for the US in Tunisia. All right, let me stop there. Thank you all for listening.